Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a totally fascinating look at a true mastermind. We're talking about a guy who literally engineered his way from driving beer delivery trucks to absolutely conquering Eastern Bloc motorsport. Yep, we're looking at the legacy of Heinz Melkus, a name that is totally synonymous with speed, ingenuity, and just sheer force of will in post-war East Germany. Let's get right into it.
So imagine this for a second. How do you build a racing dynasty under the extreme resource scarcity of post-war East Germany? I mean, when you don't have access to factory parts, massive budgets, or even basic materials, how do you compete? It sounds impossible, right? But as we're going to see for Heinz Melkus, those constraints weren't roadblocks at all. They were actually the very foundation of his mechanical genius. Picture Melkus in the 1960s, tucked into the cockpit of a beautifully streamlined, silver, cigar-shaped racer. But here's the kicker. He wasn't just the driver. He actually built the machine he's sitting in. He perfectly blended this dual identity of a daring racing pilot and a brilliant, entirely self-taught engineer. It's the absolute pinnacle of his open-wheel era, and it proves he was the ultimate master of both the track and the workshop. All right, here's our track map for today's Explainer. We'll start with the scrapyard racer, move into engineering the early years, dive into the Melkus 64 revolution, watch him ruling the Eastern Bloc, and finally, building a racing dynasty. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the Scrapyard Racer, from beer deliveries to the track. Back in the early 1950s, the Western racing standard meant purpose-built factory parts, dedicated tuning, and just vast resources. But Melkus's amateur reality over in Dresden, vastly different. While he was working as a transport and beer delivery driver for the Wernesgrüner brewery, he literally pieced together his first cars from wrecked military vehicles left over from the war. Imagine modifying a VW Schwimmwagen chassis, which is a literal amphibious military car, and dropping in a salvaged 80-horsepower French airplane engine just to get on the track. It's the ultimate story of ingenuity born out of absolute necessity. And you know what? That incredible scrappiness paid off remarkably fast. By 1954, racing a salvaged Alfa Romeo-powered Veritas that he'd heavily modified, his sheer determination earned him the prestigious title of Best Private Driver of the DDR. Against staggering odds and well-funded competitors, his technical resourcefulness was already transforming him from an amateur hobbyist into an absolute legend.
Which leads us right into Section 2, engineering the early years, transitioning to constructor.
So, immense frustration with the unreliability and sheer scarcity of parts pushed him to stop just driving and formally construct his own single-seaters. In 1955, he built the Eigenbau Post using a JAP Speedway engine. That was a lightweight motorcycle engine adapted for racing. It was fast, for sure, but fragile, so he adapted. By 1959, he introduced the Plattglocke, playfully named for its unique ironing bell shape, which massively improved the aerodynamics. Then, by 1961, came the Blechauto, or the Kettenwartberg, featuring a super clever chain drive system that let him easily swap out gears to suit different tracks. With every single iteration, his chassis evolved, becoming aerodynamically sleeker and mechanically far superior to his rivals. And that brings us to Section 3, the Melkus 64 revolution, and his big leap into professional manufacturing. By 1964, Melkus launched his own collective in Dresden, officially transitioning into a full-fledged professional manufacturer to produce his masterpiece, the Melkus 64. He perfected that aerodynamic cigar profile, and underneath, a welded tubular frame weighing an astonishingly light 40 kilograms. That's basically the weight of a medium-sized dog. And for power, he custom-tuned a standard Wartburg 3-cylinder 2-stroke engine. Now, a 2-stroke engine is incredibly simple. You usually find them in lawnmowers or mopeds, but his team pushed it from 72 up to a staggering 100 horsepower. Squeezing that much power out of such a tiny engine, inside an ultralight chassis, it completely revolutionized Eastern racing standards. 80. That is the number of Melkus 64 units they built. Now, I know 80 might not sound like a lot compared to global automakers today, but in the context of custom-built Eastern Bloc race cars, it is massive. And here's where Melkus's sharp business acumen really shines. He cleverly sold large batches of these vehicles to the Soviet Union. Why? Because selling his superior cars to the USSR generated the crucial capital he needed to fund his own personal racing efforts and to develop the next generation of vehicles. It was just a brilliant, self-sustaining loop. Armed with those new machines, we enter Section 4, ruling the Eastern Bloc with complete dominance. Well, the results of that engineering loop really speak for themselves. The Cup of Peace and Friendship was the absolute premier racing series for socialist countries, basically the Eastern equivalent to Western international formula racing. Melkus wasn't just competing, he was the undisputed king, taking the individual championship in 63, 65, 66, 67, and 72. Add to that his 5 East German champion titles. Whether he was in the early Ketten Wartburg or the mighty Melkus 64, his engineering superiority resulted in absolute, undeniable competitive dominance across the continent. But then, disaster struck. It became known as the 1971 FIA Abyss. The Western-based FIA suddenly changed International Formula 3 rules, which was the primary open-wheel racing category they competed in. The new rules required race engines to be based on production models with a minimum of 5,000 units built within a single year. This was a massive, existential threat that nearly wiped out Eastern racing entirely, simply because no manufacturer in the DDR was producing suitable racing engines at that volume. Basically overnight, the classic Melkus-Ziegare era faced extinction. But true innovators don't quit. Section 5, building a racing dynasty, adapting and thriving. Did Melkus quit? Absolutely not. He and his fellow Eastern Bloc organizers quickly pivoted, forging entirely new racing classes like Formula C9 and Formula Easter, relying on Lada and Wartburg engines that fit those new criteria. But what's truly spectacular is how his expertise expanded far beyond the track. Enter the Melkus RS1000. This was a street-legal gull-wing sports car based on the Wartburg 353 chassis. With 101 units built, it became widely known as the Ferrari of the East. It represents the absolute pinnacle of his manufacturing design legacy, proving he wasn't just a master of open-wheel racers, but a legendary sports car manufacturer too. Let's quickly summarize this epic journey. Step 1. An amateur scrounging VW parts and old airplane engines in post-war ruins. Step 2. Rising to rule Eastern Europe as a master constructor and champion driver. Step 3. Building a lasting dynasty. Along with his son Uli, he developed the highly successful SRG MT77 race car. And eventually, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Heinz Melkus opened the very first BMW dealership in the former DDR. He literally engineered his way out of poverty and isolation into tremendous, lasting success. Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. What could the premier racing expert of the East have achieved without the constraints of the Cold War? I mean, if Heinz Melkus could build a motorsport empire, engineer gull-wing sports cars, and dominate racing circuits using scrapped parts and chain-driven Wartburg engines, just imagine what his boundless mechanical genius could have created on the world stage with the limitless resources of a Ferrari or a Porsche. It's an absolutely incredible what-if to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the impossible.